is there some version of the alien conversation that could incorporate the breaking of frameworks?
Well, I think so. I mean, the key question would be, we've had the Pentagon release multiple videos of strange UFOs that undermined a lot of us. I just think it's also really fascinating to talk about the fact that those of us who were trained to call BS on all of this stuff just had the rug pulled out from under us by the Pentagon choosing to do this. And you know what the effect of that is? You've opened the door for every stupid theory known to man. My aunt saw a ghost. Okay, now we're going to have to listen to, well, hey, the Pentagon used to deny it. Then it turned out there were UFOs, dude. Whoever is in charge of lying to the public, they need a cost function that incorporates the damage and trust. Because I held this line that this was all garbage and all BS. Now I don't know what to think.
I like to call UAP evolutionary primers because whether that's their intention or not, the hearts and minds of man will awaken to new realities once disclosure dawns. Collectively, all 8 billion of us SOBs will soberly look at a singular subject, that being, of course, the technologies in our airspace and oceans that utilize unknown physics and are controlled by unknown provenance. Because of the interconnectedness of our species that was catapulted in 1991 with the advent of the internet, this will be a first time in our species' history where so many minds will simultaneously focus on a single subject, but not just any subject, mind you. An answer to mankind's second greatest question, biggest question. Are we alone in the universe? Of course, the biggest question our species has is whether or not our consciousness persists beyond the death of our physical existence. The following clip is taken from the YouTube channel New Thinking Aloud. It's part of Jeffrey Mishlove's award speech from Robert Bigelow's Institute for Consciousness Studies contest on who could write an essay providing the best evidence that consciousness survives death.
Knowledge of the afterlife is knowledge of human consciousness. And to the extent that the human civilization ignores this area of research, we are lacking in self-knowledge. And this gap in our understanding is a woeful, sorry gap. And let me take it one step further. Robert Bigelow has suggested that I might comment on where I think all this interest in the afterlife is leading. Here is my opinion. If the human race is to enter the community of civilizations in this galaxy, for example, capable of interstellar space travel, we have to understand hyperspace. And that means the relationships between hyperspace and consciousness. And that means understanding the afterlife.
You'll notice that parapsychologist Jeffrey Mishlove cited the word hyperspace, a word that I frankly wasn't familiar with and still don't have a very good grasp of. Nevertheless, to remedy some of my ignorance, I went into the library of Jeffrey Mishlove's YouTube channel, New Thinking Aloud, and typed in the word hyperspace, and thankfully, there was an interview that covered it into some depth with the guest, Dr. Bernard Carr, Emeritus Professor of Mathematics and Astronomy at Queen Mary University of London. In a video titled Hyperspace, Consciousness and Time with Bernard Carr, a link to that very excellent interview is in the description below. Here is Bernard Carr's hypothesis on hyperspace architecture as I understand it. And just by going over his explanation here, will help give you greater clarity on the idea of what hyperspace entails. And the point about out-of-body space, it looks like physical space and is sometimes almost indistinguishable, but it is a distorted physical space, and therefore it's not exactly physical space. You leave your body, you go through the ceiling, and then you notice that the chimney's got the wrong shape or something like that. It's a distorted space. It's a distorted version of physical space. But of course, a precise relationship between OBE space and physical space is important. And then, of course, people have near-death experiences. And when they have near-death experiences, they seem to go beyond the physical space. They cross the bridge or whatever, they go through the light, and they seem to access a higher dimensional space. And then again, people have mystical experiences. And they also seem to be experiencing a space. But these are now spaces which are different from normal physical space. And I think I've referred to before to the problem of ghosts and apparitions. They seem to be in a space, but not normal physical space in the sense that you can't normally photograph them or feel them. It seems to be a space, but not normal physical space. And so my approach is to say, well, all of these phenomena seem to need a space. So you've got phenomenal space, that is physical. You've got dream space. You've got OBE space. You've got NDE space. You've got apparition space. You've got mystical space. They all seem to need a space, but it goes beyond ordinary physical space. So my hypothesis is that you actually need a hierarchy of spaces, and you actually need a higher dimensional space, which I call a universal structure. And this universal structure is the space which is meant to accommodate all mental experience. So it accommodates normal mental experiences with that 5-dimensional model. It can incorporate, if you like, paranormal experiences that go beyond the normal physical world, and even mystical experiences, which go, if you like, further beyond the physical world. So the idea is there is a sort of hierarchy of spaces. So in that clip with Jeffrey, he states, knowledge of the afterlife is knowledge of human consciousness. And I would add that it's knowledge of the human experience. That we are far more than the, if we're lucky, 75, 85, 95 plus years of our sojourn on this earth. That what we are, our true nature, far exceeds that temporary trajectory. In that clip with Jeffrey Mishlove, he also stated, to the extent that the human civilization ignores this area of research, that is, the afterlife, we are lacking in self-knowledge. This gap in our understanding is a woeful, sorry gap. So previously I told you that I define UAP as evolutionary primers. Well, let me add another term to the bag. UAP are also gap annihilators. In 2021, Robert Bigelow, real estate billionaire tycoon, he wanted to see how many academics around the planet might be studying consciousness from a scientific point of view. So he sponsored an essay contest offering large prizes for the top 3 essays. And these essays were based on the subject of what is the best evidence that consciousness survives death. Because he got so many amazing essays to review with his panel, he ended up expanding the prize money. He added 11 runner-ups that would win $50,000 and 15 honorable mentions that would win $20,000. So the prize money went from $950,000 for these essays to $1.8 million. Now, I think Robert Bigelow was ahead of his time. And I think what he's doing here, and he's going to run another contest in 2023 that focuses on contact. So whereas his first contest was the best evidence that consciousness survives death, which, by the way, Jeffrey Mishlove won, this subsequent contest is going to be about contact with souls from the other side, if you will, and demonstrating that reality and providing the best evidence for that reality in essay form. And I think right now the plan is $1 million in prize money. So Robert Bigelow is funding this kind of research right now. But as Jeffrey Mishlove said, there's a huge gap in our civilization of time and money going into this question, which is so central to self-knowledge. I anticipate that after disclosure, these sort of issues will be examined in much greater focus and attention, with much greater focus and attention. And people are going to start saying exactly what Eric Weinstein said at the opening of this video. And I got the quote right in front of me. Those of us who were trained to call BS on all of this stuff just had the rug pulled out from under us by the Pentagon choosing to do this. And you know what the effect of this is? You've opened the door for every stupid theory known to man. My aunt saw a ghost. Okay, now we're going to have to listen to, well, hey, the Pentagon used to deny it, then it turned out there were UFOs, dude. I'm not suggesting that disclosure, which can be defined as smoking gun evidence of non-human technology in our biosphere being provided, is going to somehow prove that the other quote-unquote stupid theories that Eric Weinstein cited will automatically be correct. I'm not even saying that I know disclosure is going to happen, because as you all know, I always say I could be wrong, but it is my assessment. But what I am saying is that there's no question that one of the consequences of disclosure is that other potential realities are going to get a lot more attention than they ever would have prior to disclosure. There is no question in my mind about that at all. It's just common sense. And here's my prediction, which is a paradox of paradox, an irony of ironies. For 70 plus years, our greatest minds, our greatest institutions, our great journalists, our great academics have laughed and ridiculed the UAP topic. And those that have come forward saying it's real have also been ridiculed and laughed at and marginalized. If it ends up being real, it will be the greatest discovery of human history. A discovery that was mocked by our greatest minds. But it gets even better than that. What has been so overwhelmingly mocked will be focused on more than any other scientific mystery within our 8 billion population. But it gets even better. I will go so far to predict the very topic that has been ridiculed and assessed to have been complete malarkey will act as a trigger to look and attend to other topics, such as what we're about to dig into, which is near-death experiences, but also psi. And that these matters will ultimately also get proven to exist just as UAP have. That's one heck of a paradox. The very topic that has been ridiculed and laughed at and marginalized not only ends up being true, but becomes a trigger to other great discoveries. So this brings us to the examination of the phenomenon known as near-death experiences, which I'm going to dive into and give you my take and perspective. which will be primarily based on a book titled Life After Life by Dr. Raymond Moody. It was published in 1975. It sold more than 13 million copies and translated into a dozen foreign languages. He is known to be the father of near-death experiences, and it has been stated that he coined that term to apply to people having the experience when they clinically die or get close to death of going outside of their body, and then sometimes even further into that realm, if you will. So let's begin. At one point, Raymond Moody would bring up in his philosophy courses the subject of human survival of biological death. And to his amazement, he found that in almost every class of 30 or so students, at least one student would come to him afterwards and relate a personal near-death experience. It states in his book, "What has amazed me since the beginning of my interests are the great similarities in the reports, despite the fact that they come from people of highly varied religious, social, and educational backgrounds." What I find interesting about that is, first of all, of course, the sheer number of human beings that have had near-death experiences. But also, this scenario reminds me a lot of UFO experiencers. If Dr. Raymond Moody, in his philosophical course, were to bring up the idea of people having sightings of technologies that surpass known capabilities, would the same scenario unfold except with people that have seen UAP? So I find that interesting. To me, this underscores there really is a gap in our understanding of reality and of human consciousness, because for so long, these topics have been ridiculed. And I think disclosure is going to accelerate, like nothing preceding it, an end to ridicule and a diving into the abyss. I'm going to focus on some of the elements of a near-death experience. Here's a quote from his book. "In fact, the similarities among various reports are so great that one can easily pick out about 15 separate elements which reoccur again and again in the massive narratives that I've collected." He then writes, "On the basis of these points of likeness, let me now construct a brief theoretically ideal or complete experience which embodies all of the common elements in the order in which it is typical for them to occur." I'm not going to share with you this theoretical, ideal, or complete experience because I think it'd be a little bit redundant. But there are a couple points he makes about that ideal or complete experience, which embodies all of the common elements, which I want to share with you because I think it will lay the groundwork for when we go into these elements individually. So I'm going to read a few of those pointers directly from his book. He states, "I have found no one person who reports every single component of the composite experience. Very many have reported most of them, that is 8 or more of the 15 or so, and a few have reported up to 12. So of the elements that have been repeatedly recorded in near-death experiences. The order in which a dying person goes through the various stages briefly delineated above may vary from that given in my theoretical model. To give one example, various persons have reported seeing the being of light before or at the same time they left their physical bodies, and not as in the model sometime afterward. However, the order in which the stages occur in the model is a very typical order, and wide variations are unusual." And the final pointer I want to cite before we move forward is, "How far into the hypothetical complete experience a dying person gets seems to depend on whether or not the person actually underwent an apparent clinical death, and if so, on how long he was in this state. In general, persons who were dead seem to report more florid, complete experiences than those who only came close to death. And those who were dead for a longer period go deeper than those who were dead for a shorter time. One uniform experience of people that have had near-death experiences is that they will say that there are no words to describe their experiences. They are simply ineffable. That is, inexpressible. And that's really interesting. A lot of times, experiencers who have had NDEs will say that their experiences were more real than real and more real than their experience prior to their NDE in this physical realm, if you will. I don't know why that is, but that makes me think of the theory some have that the brain acts as a reducing valve or filter that limits consciousness. So when consciousness exits the body, that means that reducing valve or filter is no longer applying to the consciousness. And therefore that would make sense if that's the case, that people would say that their existence feels more real than it did prior to them dying. Because when they were alive, their consciousness was limited via the physical brain. Now that they have left their physical body, their consciousness becomes a lot more potent and expansive. Thus, everything feels more real. Regarding ineffability, Raymond writes, one woman put this to me very succinctly when she said, now, there's a real problem for me as I'm trying to tell you this because all the words I know are three-dimensional. As I was going through this, her near-death experience, I kept thinking, well, when I was taking geometry, they always told me there were only 3 dimensions, and I always just accepted that. But they were wrong. There are more. And of course, our world, the one we're living in now, is 3-dimensional, but the next one definitely isn't. And that's why it's so hard to tell you this. I have to describe it to you in words that are 3-dimensional. That's as close as I can get to it, but it's not really adequate. I can't really give you a complete picture. So in light of this passage, perhaps the deeper you go into reality, the more real it feels. And wouldn't that be sort of ironic that the depth of reality is explored much more intimately when we're dead, so to speak, than when we're alive? Traveling at high speed through a dark tunnel is a classic element of the near-death experience. Here's what one individual told Raymond regarding his experience. Before the time of his experience, which took place when he was a child, one man had had a fear of the dark. Yet when his heart stopped beating from internal injuries incurred in a bicycle accident, I had the feeling that I was moving through a deep, very dark valley. The darkness was so deep and impenetrable that I could see absolutely nothing, but this was the most wonderful, worry-free experience you can imagine. Exiting the body and beginning the process of transitioning to your new abode, if you will, can be likened to traveling to a new country halfway across the world. Or even more dramatically, getting in a spaceship and traveling to a new planet many light years away. Except those analogies wouldn't come even close to doing justice that the transition from your consciousness being within the human container to leaving that container comprises of. In fact, I would go so far to say that the transition from your consciousness being locked into your container into where it goes after that container expires is about 1,000 times more profound and mysterious than traveling to a new country or to a planet many light years away. I really like the idea that this man recounting his near-death experience from when he was a child, he said that when he was a child, he had a fear of the dark. And yet, when he left his body as a child and was in what he described like a deep, very dark valley, traveling through it, darkness so deep and impenetrable that he could see absolutely nothing. And yet he recounts that this was the most wonderful, worry-free experience you can imagine. So the dynamics of the afterlife, if you will, are quite unique. This kind of reminds me of when people say they see a being of light. And they say that this being of light is many times more bright than that of even the sun. But unlike the sun, where if you look at the sun with your physical body, you have to look away, with the light being, even though it's described as far more bright than the physical sun, you can look at it indefinitely. Now, granted, you don't have physical eyes, but still, I find that really intriguing. Now, actually seeing your body like a spectator is, of course, a central feature to the near-death experience. Now, whether consciousness is actually leaving the body or it's just chemicals in the mind, well, I don't know. Personally, I do believe consciousness is leaving the body, and there's reasons I assess that, but that's beyond the scope of this video. With these out-of-body experiences, many people report being conceptually confused and do not link it to death for some time, which I find interesting that this kind of confusion ensues. To me, this is like the very genesis of adapting to their new reality, that they're dead. But they don't know they're dead most of the time, it seems, in the immediate aftermath of their consciousness exiting the body. Moody notes that after leaving the body, most people report at first a desperate desire to get back in their bodies, but they do not have the faintest idea about how to proceed. And there's actually a wide range of responses when people leave the body. Some of the reactions are more positive, though. Feelings of concern for the body is common when people see it as a spectator, which is how you see it when you're having an NDE. One young woman who was a nursing student at the time of her experience expressed, "This is sort of funny, I know, but in nursing school, they had tried to drill it into us that we ought to donate our bodies to science. Well, all through this, as I watched them trying to start my breathing again, I kept thinking, I don't want them to use that body as a cadaver." By and large, most people have reported having a new body when they exit their physical body, which we can call a spiritual body. Raymond Moody notes, "This new body is one of the 2 or 3 aspects of death experiences in which the inadequacy of human language presents the greatest obstacles. Almost everyone who has told me of this body has at some point become frustrated and said, I can't describe it, or made some remark to the same effect. Words and phrases which have been used by various subjects include a mist, a cloud, smoke like, a vapor, transparent, a cloud of colors, wispy, an energy pattern, and others which express similar meanings. Travel within the spiritual body is apparently exceptionally easy. Naturally, physical objects do not present any barriers, and movement from one place to another can become extremely rapid, almost instantaneous. Some recall even thought becoming unimpeded and not just travel. Raymond Moody notes, "Over and over I have been told that once they become accustomed to their new situation, people undergoing this experience begin to think more lucidly and rapidly than in physical existence. For example, one man told me that while he was dead, things that are not possible now are then. Your mind is so clear. It's so nice. My mind took everything down and worked everything out for me the first time without having to go through it more than once. After a while, everything I was experiencing got to where it meant something to me in some way." I'm particularly interested in reports of a dramatic increase in lucid thinking by people who claim their consciousness has left their body. As you may recall, earlier in this video, I conveyed that some theorize that the physical mind behaves and is a filter, a reduction valve, if you will, that reduces consciousness down to a trickle of which most of us experience on a day-to-day basis. If that's correct, then it does make sense that once consciousness is no longer tethered to the physical mind, that its capabilities would increase exponentially. And to me, this factors into reports of people saying that once their consciousness left their body, it felt more real than the reality they experienced prior to their consciousness leaving their body. Because a very significant component of what gives us the impression of reality, I think anyways, is our thoughts. And so if our thoughts become much more lucid, that could have the effect of making us feel much more real. And indeed, more real than when our consciousness is tethered to the physical body. And it's kind of cool if it's true, because in some real sense, we ultimately all become basically super geniuses once our consciousness is no longer tethered to our body, because our computational skills increase exponentially. And another factor that is reported from people who claim that their consciousness have left their body is in that state, they feel a sense of timelessness that has no parallel with the experience of time when consciousness is tethered to the body. And my understanding is that sense of timelessness is immediate. It doesn't require that they go through the dark tunnel or see loved ones or see the being of light, but it's as if right when consciousness leaves the body, the experience of time is inherently different and feels like a timelessness as opposed to a linear sensation of time that we have within the physical body. Vision and hearing, which are correlated with senses that we have while tethered to the physical body, are reported to increase exponentially when consciousness becomes untethered to the body. In this portion of an interview that Raymond Moody conducted, I believe, with a woman who was out of her body following an accident, this is what she had to say. There was a lot of action going on and people running around the ambulance. And whenever I would look at a person to wonder what they were thinking, it was like a zoom up, exactly like through a zoom lens. And I was there. But it seemed that part of me, I'll call it my mind, was still where I had been, several yards away from my body. When I wanted to see someone at a distance, it seemed like part of me, kind of like a tracer, would go to that person. And it seemed to me at the time that if something happened any place in the world, that I could just be there. While I can't say for sure, and we won't know until the moment comes when we are no longer within the container of our physical body, from the reporting of Raymond Moody in the book Life After Life, it does appear that the capacities of the spirit untethered from the body are exponentially more advanced than when they are tethered to the body. Now, there may be experiences that you cannot have in the, shall we call it, world to come, that you can have in the physical domain, simply because there are things you can do and experience with limitations that you are beholden to in the physical world that you cannot experience outside of it untethered from the body. I would argue that our most natural habitat as beings of consciousness, if you will, is not the physical realm. Our most natural habitat is the world to come, or the spirit world, or heaven, or whatever you want to call it. That is our most natural abode. We don't experience time there the way we experience it in the physical world. In fact, I would argue that the way time is experienced in the physical world is alien to our true nature as an extension of the divine. I don't think the divine experiences time the way we do in this physical world. And when our consciousness exits the body, we begin to experience time more akin to how the Almighty experiences time, that is, in a timeless fashion. Time seems inherent, it seems necessary, it seems like it has to be there. But from these reports, even though it may be counterintuitive, I would argue that time is something that is intrinsic to the physical realm, but not intrinsic to the spiritual realm. Now, what timelessness feels like, I have no idea, because there's no parallel in this world. Raymond Moody notes that hearing in the spiritual state can apparently be called so only by analogy, and most say that they do not really hear physical voices or sounds. Rather, they seem to pick up the thoughts of persons around them. As one lady put it in explaining her experience to Raymond, I could see people all around and I could understand what they were saying. I didn't hear them audibly like I'm hearing you. It was more like knowing what they were thinking, exactly what they were thinking, but only in my mind, not in their actual vocabulary. I would catch it the second before they opened their mouths to speak. I would argue that communication using vocal cords is primitive in comparison to communication that is more pristine and doesn't require the physics of sound. And so human beings seem to advance in just about every way when their consciousness is no longer tethered to the body. And that applies to communication as well. And I think it's interesting that if you look at the literature of those that claim they have had contact with non-human intelligences, in the vernacular it's often called the abduction phenomenon, that these beings do not talk using vocal cords, but speak in a more advanced way using telepathy. And I find it interesting that in that woman's experience, who had an NDE, she emphasized that she knew exactly what they were thinking, but only in her mind, not audibly. And when you look at the near-death experience literature, the soul comes into contact with the light being, just as an example, which is interpreted as God usually. There's not even vocabulary. There's no language. And language, by the way, at best, are mere metaphors. Each word is a metaphor. But the communication, when it's telepathic on this level, is just utterly precise. There's no room for misinterpretation. And it seems that when consciousness leaves the body, the soul can still perceive what the person is saying, but on a much more deeper level. So theoretically, if someone had an NDE and left their body and was paying attention to what someone was saying and that person was lying, they would know they're lying because they're not listening through vocal cords. They're listening through the precise mental framework that's being expressed by the human in physical form. A really interesting experience that is often cited by those that have had NDEs is that in the immediate aftermath of leaving their body, they feel a profound degree of loneliness because they're so disconnected all of a sudden from the world they've always known. Raymond Moody notes, in this disembodied state, then, a person is cut off from others. He can see other people and understand their thoughts completely, but they are able neither to see nor to hear him. Communication with other human beings is effectively cut off, even through the sense of touch, since his spiritual body lacks solidity. Thus, it is not surprising that after a time in this state, profound feelings of isolation and loneliness set in. As one man put it, he could see everything around him in the hospital, all the doctors, nurses, and other personnel going about their tasks, yet he could not communicate with them in any way. So, quote unquote, he stated, I was desperately alone. Another person communicated to Moody regarding this phenomenon. I was unable to touch anything, unable to communicate with any of the people around. It is an awesome, lonely feeling, a feeling of complete isolation. I knew that I was completely alone by myself. I find it fascinating, these recountings from various people about feeling a profound sense of loneliness after their consciousness leaves the body because they can no longer touch things, touch people. They can no longer communicate with people, even though they can still understand what people are saying, telepathically at least. And it's interesting because this really kind of underscores that if consciousness truly does leave the body, your basic humanity remains unscathed, if you will. Now, I would imagine that as a soul goes deeper into the world to come, goes through the life review and so forth, their psychological composition, if you will, probably does change a lot. But they adapt to their new life, if you want to call it. Nevertheless, the essence of the person lives on from what I can see. And I've said this before to you in this video. I don't assess that these experiences are just the result of the brain not getting enough oxygen and chemical responses and all that. I personally assess that these are windows, these experiences that people have are windows into what the process is like once the physical container dies and what animated that physical container proceeds on its journey. But you know what? Even if it is merely a reaction chemically of the brain of someone dying, it's still fascinating to hear their testimony, regardless. But I would say this, if it is all just chemical reactions in the mind of a mind that's dying, it's so funny how it's all arguably very logical. They leave their body. They can see their body from a distance. They say they can hear what people say telepathically, not audibly. So the way they process information changes drastically during these events. And they talk about how in the immediate aftermath, sometimes they have distress by seeing their body as a spectator. And then, as we just went over, feeling lonely because they've lost connection to the world. These seem like very logical responses that consciousness would have if suddenly it was dislodged from the body. I think that's compelling, but far from proof that what they say is happening is actually happening. Anyways, these feelings of profound loneliness do soon get dispelled as they go deeper into their near-death experience. This will be the last installment of this video. There will be a follow-up to this video, continuing my analysis of NDEs, but only if this video does well. So if you enjoyed this video and you want me to do another one where I continue analyzing more elements of the near-death experience, including the life review, which I'm particularly interested in, please share this on social media, because that tells me that it's worth my time and effort to make a follow-up. Anyways, what I want to get into for the last segment is a presentation that Robert Bigelow and Colm Kelleher did recently for the BICS, which is the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies Grants Program 2023. So we've discussed this briefly. Robert Bigelow of BICS did a contest in 2021 for the best essays on the evidence that consciousness survives death. The contest in 2023 is focused on contact, communication with the other side. Anyways, during this presentation, someone in the audience asked, has there been any risks or dangers in pursuing this topic?
What are the dangers or risks associated with this sort of research into the unknown?
We have, since we started BICS, and I may as well mention this, I don't know, in March of 2020, those ourselves, members of our family, and especially members of our staff, had a lot of things begin, and it hasn't stopped. So there seems to be some kind of connection to attention and a stimulus from the various phenomena. And it also happens in a sister area or another subject, the same kind of thing. And you don't know exactly how to predict what's going to be happening. Sometimes it's adverse. In a very small, minor minority of instances, but sometimes, and we've experienced that.
Yesterday, on September 13th, I probably put more work into this video on near-death experiences than I did today or prior to yesterday. And when I went to sleep yesterday evening, or yesterday very late, because I put so much time into the video all night, when I got into my bed, I felt an overwhelming feeling that there was a presence. It was overbearing. It was, it almost felt obnoxious, or like it was a violation. It was that in my face. Now, I'm not suggesting by any stretch of the imagination that the feeling I had or the impression I had necessitates that there was some kind of presence in my bedroom. All I can say is it felt overwhelmingly like there was. And I also think it's important to underscore that while it did feel alarming, for sure, that doesn't necessarily mean that if there was a presence that it was ill-willed. It could just be as simple as there was a presence, I felt it strongly, and that inherently will feel alarming because it's so foreign to me. If it really was a presence, there's the debate of should it be there in your face like that? Well, that's beyond the scope of this conversation. But it's funny that I had that experience, and I've felt presences before. Every once in a very rare blue moon, but it's not usually, always very subtle. This wasn't subtle. This was in your face. It was obnoxious. It felt like a violation. And, whether that was my mind playing tricks on me or I was actually perceiving something like a spirit in my bedroom, I have no idea. But and this is only anecdotal, obviously, but it does tie into what Robert Bigelow said in that clip I just shared with you, that him and his staff have had weird experiences seemingly as a result of pouring into the subject of near-death experiences. And as Robert Bigelow put it, there seems to be a connection between attention and stimulus from the various phenomena. Now, that begs the question, if there's any truth to that, and I don't know if there is, could this be one of the reasons disclosure is frowned upon. So you have 8 billion people on this planet focusing on UAP and all of the literature surrounding it, all the peripheral literature. And it will inevitably lead to looking more closely at other phenomena such as near-death experiences, psi, telepathy. Would that concentration of attention from humanity cause some sort of change in activity from the various phenomena on this planet? We are chin deep in speculation land right now, but it's fun to think about. What I would say, however, is that if it is true that UAP are real and that some of them stem from non-human intelligence, well, it's an absolute inevitability that that knowledge will become scientific fact at some point. So it's, even if there was some truth to this, it would not be a valid excuse to cover it up, because by doing so, you are leading humanity down a very dangerous road where their trust in government will only disintegrate further than it otherwise had to. Better to come clean now. If you're going to have a problem anyways, it's better to minimize your problems and keep them at a minimum, as opposed to having multiple problems when you only need one, if you will. I cannot recommend the book Life After Life by Dr. Raymond Moody enough. It's concise, it's to the point, it's centered upon testimony from people who have experienced near-death experiences. It's written exceedingly well. I don't know if it gets much better than that. The first link below in the description is actually an affiliate link that will take you directly to the book on Amazon. And if you click it and finalize a purchase, I'll get a commission and it will actually help the channel out. Please do not forget to subscribe. And if you'd like to help the channel out in other ways, you could become a patron, you could become a YouTube member, you could buy some merch, you could even give me a one-time donation. All of those possibilities are in the description below, or you could just slap a like on this bad boy and I will appreciate it so much. Thank you so much for watching. And if you're still watching, I want you to put in the description below, victory. Victory. Just so I know you got to this point and I can feel all warm and fuzzy on the inside. I'll see you in the next episode. Special thanks to all patrons, YouTube members, those that have bought merch, those that have given me a one-time donation. I couldn't do without you. Thank you so much. See you in the next episode.